She said her phone had died. I was standing in the kitchen when I called again, more out of habit than concern. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft rattle of the vent over the stove. Our son was asleep upstairs. A half-folded load of laundry sat on the chair by the table. It was an ordinary night, the kind you stop noticing when life settles into routine. Sarah had texted an hour earlier saying she was still out and her battery was almost gone. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those small updates married people send without thinking. I didn't think much of it either. I just wanted to hear her voice before I went to bed. So I hit call one more time. The ringing lasted longer than usual. Long enough for me to look down at the screen and think maybe it was about to go to voicemail. Then the line picked up. A man answered. Just one word. Hello. His voice was flat, calm, like he wasn't confused about why he had my wife's phone in his hand. Then the call ended. I stood there with my phone still against my ear, listening to the dead silence on the line. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. Something inside me just shifted, clean and permanent, like a door closing in a part of the house I hadn't known was open. There are moments that don't feel loud while they're happening. No shattered glass. No raised voices. No scene. Just a small break in the pattern, and suddenly everything before it starts rearranging itself. I looked at the kitchen around me. The counter I'd wiped down 10 minutes earlier, Sarah's coffee mug still in the sink, the nightlight glowing faint down the hallway, and none of it felt different. But I was not angry yet, not even fully hurt, just awake. My name is Daniel. I'm 33 years old, and at the time, everything about my life looked stable from the outside. We lived in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of neighborhood where the lawns are cut on schedule, where people wave without stopping, and where nothing ever really seems to happen. Sarah is 35. We had been married for 6 years. Not the kind of 6 years you celebrate loudly, but the kind that settles into structure. Mortgage payments, grocery lists, shared calendars on the fridge. We had a son, 4 years old, who liked to line up his toy trucks along the hallway baseboards. Most evenings followed the same pattern. Dinner, bath time, a short argument about vegetables, then quiet. She worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics company. The job came with occasional travel. Nothing excessive. A few days here and there, Nashville, Indianapolis, sometimes Chicago. It always sounded routine when she explained it. Meetings, site visits, coordination work. I never had a reason to question it. Or maybe I just never looked closely enough. There had been small things, if I went back and laid them out properly. Delayed replies to simple texts. Times when she'd read a message but respond hours later with something short and neutral. Moments at dinner where she seemed somewhere else, nodding without really hearing what I'd said. Not often enough to stand out on their own, but consistent enough that, looking back, they formed a pattern. At the time, I explained it away without effort. Work stress, fatigue. The normal drift that happens when two people share the same space long enough. Nothing that required attention. Nothing that justified concern. She visited friends sometimes, too. Or at least that's how it was presented. An evening out, a late return, a quick explanation that didn't invite follow-up. I accepted all of it without resistance. Not because I was naive, but because routine has a way of dulling your instincts. You stop checking. You stop verifying. You trust the structure you've built. That was the version of things I was living in. Until that phone call. After that, the structure didn't collapse. It just stopped feeling solid. After that call, nothing outward changed. The house stayed quiet. The routine stayed in place. The next morning, I still woke up at the same time, still made coffee the same way, still packed my son's lunch while the news played low in the background. If someone had walked through the front door, they wouldn't have seen anything unusual. But internally, everything had shifted position. Her explanation came later that night, casual and quick. She said her phone had died earlier than expected, that she'd borrowed a charger from someone nearby, that maybe I had called at the wrong moment and reached someone else by accident. The details were light, loosely arranged, like something said just to close a gap rather than explain it. I didn't question her. I just listened, because by then, I wasn't trying to understand what she was saying. I was measuring it against what I had already seen, and it didn't line up. That was the point where things started to rearrange themselves. Not in a dramatic way. More like pieces settling into place after being loose for too long. Moments I hadn't held on to before started coming back, clearer now. Specific. Timed. The nights she went quiet halfway through conversations. The way she would angle her phone slightly away, even when there was no reason to. The brief pauses before answering simple questions. None of it had stood out on its own. But now, viewed together, it carried weight. I didn't feel the need to confront her with any of it. That part was already fading. Instead, I started paying attention to what was consistent. Not what she said, but what repeated. Patterns don't require explanation. They just need to be observed long enough to become undeniable. I noticed how often her schedule changed last minute. How certain work evenings appeared without much detail. How she became more protective of small things, her phone, her time, even the way she moved through the house. None of it was obvious if you weren't looking. But I was looking now. And once that shift happens, you don't really go back to how you were before. At a certain point, I stopped trying to make her explanations fit. There wasn't a specific moment where I decided it. It just happened gradually, like a habit wearing off. I realized I was no longer interested in finding a version of events that made things feel normal again. That part of me, the part that wanted reassurance, that wanted to smooth things over, had gone quiet. In its place was something more controlled. I didn't confront her. I didn't press for details or revisit the phone call. On the surface, everything stayed the same. I still asked how her day was. Still sat across from her at dinner. Still helped with bedtime. Still moved through the house the way I always had. If she noticed any difference, she didn't show it. But internally, the framework had changed. I stopped taking anything she said at face value. Not in an emotional way. Not with anger or suspicion that needed to be expressed. Just a quiet adjustment. I no longer relied on her words to understand what was happening. I relied on what I could observe, what I could verify, what remained consistent over time. There's a certain clarity that comes with that shift. You're no longer reacting. You're not trying to catch someone in a lie or force a confession. You're just watching things as they are, without interference. And when you do that long enough, the need for confrontation starts to feel unnecessary. Because the truth isn't something you have to argue for. It's something that reveals itself through repetition. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. I became more deliberate with my time. More aware of how things were arranged, schedules, finances, routines. Not in a controlling way, just in a way that kept everything accounted for. I made copies of statements. Took note of dates. Not because I had a plan yet, but because I understood that clarity would matter later. And through all of it, I stayed quiet. Not withdrawn. Not distant in a way that would raise concern. Just steady. That was the part she didn't notice. The absence of reaction. Because once that disappears, there's nothing left to manage. The patterns didn't take long to settle into something clear. Once I stopped listening to explanations, what remained was behavior. And behavior, when it repeats, becomes predictable. Not immediately, but consistently enough that you start to see where things don't align. It was mostly small movements. The way she held her phone closer to her body than before. Not obvious, just a slight adjustment in angle. The way she would step into another room to respond to messages that, in the past, she would have answered sitting right next to me. Sometimes it was the hallway. Sometimes the laundry room. Always somewhere just out of reach. At first, it looked like habit. Then it became timing. Certain hours in the evening when her attention shifted. Not every night, but enough to notice a rhythm. She would check her phone, pause, then stand up without saying much. A few minutes later, she'd come back with a neutral expression, like nothing had interrupted her. I didn't interrupt it. I just watched. A few days later, I checked her phone while she was asleep. Not out of impulse. It was measured. I waited until her breathing settled, until the house was completely still. Then I picked it up, careful, deliberate. There was no lock I didn't already know. The messages were easy to find. A name at the top, Mark. No need to scroll far. The conversation was active, recent, and unguarded in a way that only happens when two people believe no one else is looking. The timestamps lined up with the gaps I had already noticed. Evenings. Late replies. Moments where she had stepped away without explanation. I read enough to understand the structure. Not everything. I didn't need to. The tone was familiar. Casual, but layered. The kind of exchange that doesn't exist without history. Plans implied without being stated directly. References to places, to time spent together that hadn't been mentioned at home. It wasn't graphic. It didn't need to be. Context filled in the rest. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. No hesitation. No second look. Because by then, it wasn't about discovering anything new. It was about confirming what was already there. Once I saw his name, everything else started connecting without effort. Mark wasn't just a name in her phone. He was someone I had heard about before, mentioned in passing like any other coworker. He came up occasionally when she talked about projects or travel plans. Nothing specific, just enough to place him within the structure of her job. Now he had context. I went back through what I already knew. The trips she had taken over the past year. Nashville stood out immediately. It came up more than once. Always framed as routine work travel. Meetings, site visits, coordination with partners. The kind of explanation that doesn't invite follow-up because it sounds complete on its own. But the messages told a different version. There were references to those trips. Not direct, not spelled out in a way that would stand alone, but clear when placed against dates and locations. Inside jokes tied to places she had claimed were strictly work-related. Mentions of time spent together outside of anything that resembled a professional schedule. I didn't need to interpret it. It was already aligned. The company had been paying for those trips. Flights, hotels, meals. All of it processed through her role. What the messages made clear was that work wasn't the priority during those visits. It was just the reason they existed. That changed the scope of it. It wasn't just something contained within the marriage. It extended into her job, into the structure that supported those trips in the first place. There was overlap now between personal decisions and professional responsibility. And that overlap carried consequences beyond anything I needed to say. I didn't act on it right away. I just documented what I had seen. Dates, locations, message timing. I matched them against travel confirmations I had access to. Receipts, emails, calendar entries. Not obsessively, just enough to make sure everything lined up without gaps. And it did. There's a point where information stops being emotional and becomes factual. Once it reaches that point, it doesn't require interpretation. It doesn't need discussion. It just exists as it is. That's where I was now. Not reacting. Not deciding anything out loud. Just letting the full picture settle into place, piece by piece, until there was nothing left that needed to be guessed. I brought it up on a Tuesday evening. Nothing about the day stood out. I got home at the usual time. We ate dinner without interruption. Our son talked about something from school, something small that would have held my attention completely a week earlier. I listened, responded where I needed to, kept everything moving at the same pace it always had. After he went to bed, the house settled into that quiet stretch it always reached around 9. She was in the living room, sitting at the end of the couch with her phone in her hand. The television was on, but neither of us was watching it. I stood there for a moment, just long enough to confirm there was nothing left I needed to check. Then I said his name. Mark. That was it. No lead-in. No explanation. She looked up immediately. Not confused. Just still. What about him, she asked. Her tone was controlled, but there was a pause behind it. Small, but there. I didn't move closer. Didn't raise my voice. I just held the same position and repeated it once. I know. That was enough to shift things. She shook her head slightly, like she was dismissing something minor. Said it wasn't what it looked like. That it was just work, that I was reading into things the wrong way. The explanation came quickly, but without structure. Pieces placed together without weight behind them. I let her speak. Didn't interrupt. Didn't correct anything she said. I wasn't there to compare versions or push her into admitting something. That part had already passed. After a few seconds, her voice slowed. The certainty in it dropped just enough to notice. She paused, looked down at her hands, then back at me. It didn't mean anything, she said. I nodded once. Not in agreement. Just acknowledgement. Because by then, meaning wasn't the point. There was no argument after that. No escalation. The conversation didn't stretch out or circle back on itself. It just reached a point where there was nothing left to add. For the first time, I wasn't trying to fix what I was hearing. I was just letting it stand on its own. After that conversation, there wasn't anything left to negotiate. We didn't revisit it the next day. There were no follow-up questions, no attempts to clarify what had already been said. The house shifted into something quieter, more functional. Conversations narrowed to what was necessary. Our son, schedules, basic logistics. Everything else was left alone. I contacted a lawyer 2 days later. Not in a rush, not out of emotion. I scheduled a consultation during work hours, stepped out, and handled it the same way I would handle any other process that required attention. I brought what I had already organized, dates, financial records, travel confirmations. Nothing excessive, just enough to establish a clear timeline. The lawyer didn't need much explanation. Once I laid it out, the structure spoke for itself. The advice was direct. Separate finances. Document everything. Keep communication minimal and focused. No escalation. No unnecessary contact. Let the process move the way it was designed to. That's exactly what I did. I opened a separate account that same week, redirected my income, reviewed joint expenses, and reduced anything that wasn't essential. It wasn't about cutting her off. It was about creating distance where it mattered. At home, nothing looked different from the outside. We still moved through the same spaces, still followed the same routines for our son. But there was a clear separation in how things operated. No shared conversations beyond what was required. No attempts to repair or revisit what had already ended. At the same time, I sent a short, factual report to her employer. No emotion, no commentary, just dates, locations, and a summary of what I had confirmed. I didn't speculate. I didn't accuse. I simply presented what aligned with company-funded travel and what didn't. After that, I stepped back. What they chose to do with it wasn't my responsibility. Things started to move on their own after that. Quietly, but with direction. Changes at her work. Tension that followed her home, but never turned into discussion. I didn't ask about it. I didn't need to. By then, everything that mattered was already in motion. The divorce didn't drag. Once everything was in place, it moved the way structured processes tend to move, quietly, without unnecessary friction. There were no sudden arguments, no attempts to revisit what had already been established. We followed the outline that had been set, step by step, without deviation. Communication stayed minimal. If it didn't involve our son, it didn't get discussed. Drop-off times, school updates, basic coordination, that was the extent of it. Everything else went through the proper channels. Documents were reviewed, signed, returned. Timelines were met without delay. She didn't fight it. Not openly, at least. There were moments where it seemed like she might try to shift something. Small comments, indirect questions, but they never developed into anything substantial. Whatever resistance existed stayed contained, like something she chose not to pursue. I didn't engage with any of it. There was no benefit in reopening conversations that had already reached their conclusion. I stayed consistent, followed the same approach I had from the beginning. Calm, direct, and limited to what was necessary. The legal side resolved itself in months, not years. Assets were divided without dispute. The house was sold. Accounts were separated fully. Custody arrangements were established in a way that didn't require ongoing negotiation. It wasn't perfect, but it was clear, and clarity was enough. There was no final conversation between us. No moment where everything was summarized or explained one last time. No attempt at closure in the way people tend to expect. The process ended the same way it had unfolded, without excess. On the day it was finalized, I signed the last document in a quiet office, handed it back, and left. No sense of victory. No loss that needed to be expressed. Just completion, like closing a file that had already been reviewed, understood, and resolved. There was nothing left inside it that required my attention anymore. Things are quieter now, not in a dramatic way, just a different kind of stillness. The house I'm in doesn't carry the same routines. There's less movement, fewer shared habits filling the space. What remains is simple and consistent. Mornings start earlier. I make coffee, pack a smaller lunch, and move through the day without interruption. When my son is with me, everything centers around him. When he's not, the time is structured, but open. There's no need to revisit anything. That moment in the kitchen, the phone call, the voice on the other end, it doesn't come back the way it used to. Not because I avoid it, but because it no longer holds anything unresolved. It served its purpose. It showed me exactly where things stood. And once that was clear, everything else followed without resistance. I don't carry questions anymore. No need to understand why, or how long, or what could have been different. Those answers don't change outcomes. They don't rebuild anything. They just keep you tied to something that's already finished. What matters now is stability. A routine that holds. A pace that doesn't shift unexpectedly. Decisions that don't require second-guessing. It's not about rebuilding something new right away. It's about maintaining what's already steady. There's a kind of quiet in that. Not empty, just controlled. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.